Throughout history, humans have found many ways to outwardly signal that dearest, most coveted message: I am better than thou. Now, of course, we have many nuanced versions of this message. Cooler than thou, more successful than thou, but it really all comes down to a display of status, be it subtle or not so subtle. One could argue that the Italian Renaissance was peak sartorial wealth signaling. And during this time, they believed wealth literally meant virtue, so things got intense. Gold, pearls, jewels, literal wealth was woven and sewn into clothing. Trims were elaborate and so precious, they were often cut from one garment, sewn to the next, and when they reached end of life, they were meticulously disassembled. The materials weighed, melted down, and added back into the family's monetary accounts, because it was literal money that they were using. The idea of wealth being sewn into clothing isn't just an upper class thing either. Before government-backed banks, hiding gold or jewels in clothes was one of the safest ways to store money. There are many accounts of people sewing coins right into their clothes. During the Anglo-Saxon period, Brits liked using Roman coins as jewelry. We have the tragic account of the Romanov family sewing their jewels into their children's clothing. Whether it's to hide wealth or put it on display, we love attaching money to clothing. You may remember last year I made a version of this dress, crossed with a Renaissance Gomorrah or undergown. I rather fortuitously found probably the closest match I'm liable to find for this lining, so I want to make a version of this jacket, crossed with an Italian Renaissance outer gown or Zimarra. These Zimarra are depicted as a longer silhouette, usually kind of A-line, made from a solid color silk satin with, of course, an elaborate trim. But the portrait that I really like for this particular project, this is Eleonora di Toledo and her son Lorenzo. Because she's in a seated position and her arm is kind of in front of her, it almost looks like she's wearing a cropped jacket if you look at this, very literally. I also love that she's wearing this gown, which appears to be velvet in a darker color, and then her satin Zimarra on top. And then, of course, she has this really nice trim, which is just like money. I just think that this is a really great reference for this project because there are so many similarities. I started with the jacket pattern, dart removed, with a cropped A-line sweep. I added a shoulder seam and extended the length of the sleeve in reference back to Eleonora. These sleeves will be made up separately as fully autonomous garments to be attached, taken off, and interchanged with other sleeves I'll make down the road. This is typically seen more in gowns of the 16th century, but was popular practice as a way to freshen up an expensive garment. The dress I made previously is black cotton velveteen, so I think black silk satin will again reference Eleonora and make the whole fit a nice matte shine moment. Zimarra are noted in household inventories as being lined with silk taffeta, but mine will be lined with this lovely cotton silk sateen. I sewed the side seams of the body lining and self. I matched the lining and self, right sides together, and sewed around the entire perimeter, except the shoulders. I flipped the whole thing right side out through the shoulder, clipped the curved seam allowances, and carefully pressed the edges. When lining to the edge like this, I first press the seam flat, then press the edge. This creates a crease that will need to be ironed out, but does make a really nice edge. To connect the shoulders, I held the lining out of the way and pinned only the self edges, right sides together. When sewing, I continued past the self onto the lining and sewed as far as possible. This left only a 3 to 4 inch gap in the lining, which I hand stitched. Okay, so we need to talk about trims real fast. Trims from this period range from being pretty simple to being like super ornate, and they almost always include gold embroidery, which would have included a thread that was made from like a silk core, but had gold wrapped around it. Since this is probably the most obvious way that wealth was incorporated into Zimarra, I want to do sort of a play on the various ways that money has been sort of attached to clothing. I've been using this to kind of like decide placement, like, you know, where do I want these coins to sit? And so far I've just been sort of thinking about this from a purely visual standpoint, like where do they look the best? But I think because these are kind of like heavy and this is very flimsy, I think that I can actually use these to kind of help the overall structure of this a little bit. This is kind of like what I would call a sort of mid-century minimalistic design. One of the main things about minimalism is that if you're going to have decoration, the decoration should have some function, like it should actually be incorporated into the structure of the thing. I don't want to just plop a trim on top of this jacket. I want to somehow incorporate the trim into the jacket and have it perform some sort of function. These sleeves are so like floppy and just kind of like all over the place that I think if I put the coins maybe here along the bottom of the sleeve, they may help the whole jacket just kind of like sit nicer. This technique was the product of a lot of experimentation. I began by marking out the seam allowance of each sleeve panel on the wrong side of the self fabric. I then marked the trim placement. I basted a strip of nylon tulle to the trim area. I used the buttonhole stitch on my domestic machine to properly sew along the edges of the trim window. I flipped the fabric to the right side and sewed another line of buttonhole stitch. I wanted this to look kind of organic and melt into the fabric. I matched the front and back of the sleeve, right sides together, and sewed the top seam, this time with a straight stitch. Still in the domestic because it was out and I'm lazy. I sewed the same seam on the lining, pressed both seams, and matched up the lining and self right sides together. I love how the trim on the Zimarra accentuates the dropped shoulder, so I added piping made from a folded bias strip of the lining fabric to the top of the sleeve. I sandwiched this between the lining and self, seam allowance out. I sewed along the lines of buttonhole stitches through all layers. I cut through the center of the buttonhole window, being extremely careful to only cut the self fabric, not the tulle. I went back and intentionally frayed the edges of the cut satin. Yes, this is definitely a play on quality and value, etc., but it also looks cool and adds to the overall effect of the trim being embedded into the sleeve. For those unfamiliar with US currency, these are dollar coins. The US doesn't regularly use dollar coins. A dollar is usually paper currency, but they're sort of a novelty collector's series and pretty perfect for the purposes of this project. I tacked each coin in place. I used a similar method to the shoulder to close the sleeve, except that I didn't continue the stitch to the lining. I hand-stitched the lining, including the piped edge, which I folded into the lining as elegantly as possible. I'm still unpacking why this project was so satisfying to me, but it definitely was. And that's about all I have to say about that.